Welcome back to the Thomistic Mystic, where we explore Catholic theology and mind-bending philosophies inspired by Mr. Thomas Aquinas himself. And today, we're going to be diving into one of the most misunderstood passages in all of Scripture. We're talking about Genesis 3, the so-called fall narrative. And I'm going to show you that almost everything you think you know about it is probably wrong. If you're new here, stick around. We're all about blending timeless wisdom with practical insights for your spiritual journey. Last video, we saw how emotivism fails because it grounds morality in our experiences while using logical principles it can't itself ground. And today, I want to show you how that same grounding problem appears in how we read humanity's origin story. Now, the Garden of Eden has fascinated me since I converted to Christianity. It's so theologically rich that it just draws you in when you start looking under the hood. But what really gets my curiosity going was this question. What was actually meant by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And if we're going to understand what it means to be fallen, what original sin actually is, we have to get this right. Getting Genesis right is crucial if our understanding of what it means to be fallen and what original sin actually is, if that's going to be accurate, we have to take a look at where it all started. Otherwise, our theology is starting off on the wrong foot, and we're looking at everything else through the wrong lens. And these are some massive questions here that most people never even think to ask. Why did God place the serpent there? What kind of free will did Adam and Eve actually have? Did they have some inclination to sin, since they ended up sinning? Did they know moral truths ahead of time? These aren't just academic questions. How you answer them shapes everything: your view of human nature, moral responsibility, the necessity of grace, and even how salvation works. Let me start by reading the key verse that creates all the confusion. Genesis 3:7. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. Now, most people read this and think, see, they gained knowledge they didn't have before. They went from knowing nothing about good and evil to suddenly knowing everything. But here's what that interpretation misses, and this is crucial. The Hebrew text is much more sophisticated than our English translations suggest. The phrase knowledge of good and evil, which I'll put it on the screen because I can't speak Hebrew, although that is in my plans and up the pipeline for me to learn. This Hebrew word doesn't refer to abstract moral concepts. It refers to experiential knowledge, intimate familiarity with something through direct encounter. Think about how the word know works in Hebrew. When Genesis says Adam knew Eve, it's talking about intimate, experiential knowledge, the same word. So when the serpent promises they'll know good and evil, he's not offering them moral education, he's offering them moral experience. And here's what's fascinating. They've already had moral knowledge in the intellectual sense. How do we know? Because God had given them a moral command: do not eat. Aquinas explains in the Summa Theologica, first part, question 94, he argues that even in their original state, humans possess natural law, basic moral awareness, impressed by God. So they knew obedience was good and disobedience was wrong. What they lacked was experiential knowledge of what disorder actually feels like. See, sin isn't just breaking arbitrary rules, it's choosing disorder over the proper ordering of things. God's moral commandments reflect the way reality is actually structured. Think of it like a perfectly ordered garden where every plant grows in its proper place, receiving the right almost light and water. Sin is like deciding you know better than the master gardener and rearranging everything according to your own design. When you go against God's moral order, you're not just violating commands, you are disrupting the harmony between reason, will, and desire that makes human flourishing possible. They knew intellectually that disobedience would introduce disorder. What they didn't know was the existential reality of what that disorder feels like, the shame, the alienation, the internal conflict. The tree wasn't offering them moral concepts. It was offering them moral autonomy, the right to define good and evil for themselves, to determine what the proper ordering should be. They weren't gaining gardening knowledge. They were claiming the right to redesign the entire garden according to their blueprint, to be master gardener instead of the apprentices. So here's the first massive misconception that trips up almost everyone who reads the passage. Most people think Adam and Eve were morally ignorant before the fall, like moral blank slates who had never encountered right and wrong. Right? But this creates immediate logical problems. If they had no concept of right and wrong, how could God's command carry any moral weight? It's like telling someone who's never heard of promises to keep your promise. The words are meaningless without the underlying concept. And here's what actually happened. And this is where the Hebrew wordplay becomes crucial. Genesis 2:25 says that they were erumim. And remember, my Hebrew is terrible, but I'm going to do my best. I'll put it on the screen. I'll get better at it. Erumim. Something like this. And naked and unashamed. Genesis 3:1 immediately then describes the serpent as arum, cunning or crafty. You can see the wordplay here. The author is deliberately contrasting innocence, erumim, with cunning, arum. But innocence isn't ignorance. Innocence means having desires rightly ordered toward God, lacking the experiential knowledge of moral corruption, living in transparent trust. And here's something crucial that most people miss. You've probably heard about how we have an inclination to sin after the fall, right? Well, this actually shows us that before the fall, they had an inclination to do good. But notice, just like our inclination to sin now doesn't remove our ability to accept God's grace, their inclination to good didn't remove their ability to choose otherwise. Their desires naturally flowed toward what was truly good for them, but they retained genuine free choice. There was a pull toward goodness, not an absolute compulsion. Think of it like this. After the fall, we feel the pull of disordered desires, but can still choose virtue with grace. Before the fall, they felt the pull of ordered desires, but could still choose autonomy. That's what made the choice real. If they couldn't have chosen otherwise, it would have been a genuine moral test. Think of it this way. A child raised in a loving family knows that kindness is good and cruelty is bad. But they lack experiential knowledge of betrayal, manipulation, deep evil. Aquinas calls their original state original justice. Their reason was rightly ordered under God, and their desire was rightly ordered under reason. They had moral knowledge, but not moral experience with evil. They understood the command, but they never felt the pull of rebellion. It's like knowing that certain berries in the garden are poisonous versus actually eating them, and feeling the sickness course through your body. But here's where the ignorance theory completely breaks down philosophically. If moral knowledge requires experiencing evil, then moral knowledge itself becomes impossible without moral corruption. Think about what that implies. To truly understand that murder is wrong, you'd have to commit murder. To understand that betrayal is evil, you'd have to betray someone. That's not how knowledge works. You can understand that jumping off a cliff is dangerous without jumping off a cliff. The ignorance theory makes moral knowledge dependent on moral failure, which is backwards. As Aquinas explains, intellectual apprehensions of moral truth doesn't require experiential participation in moral evil. Now here's the second misconception, and this one is even more problematic. Most people think the fruit itself had some kind of magical property that downloaded moral knowledge into Adam and Eve. they picture it like Neo from the Matrix, you know. They picture it like Neo getting martial arts uploaded in the Matrix. Instant knowledge transfer through supernatural fruit consumption. But the text gives us no indication that the tree had mystical properties. In fact, it suggests the opposite. Look at what actually happened in verse 7. Their eyes were opened, and they knew that they were naked. Notice what they gained knowledge of. Their nakedness. Not abstract moral principle, not the nature of good and evil, their own vulnerability and shame. This is knowledge gained by consequence, not by mystical download. They now know evil because they have done it and felt its effects. They experience separation from God, shame, fear, relational fracture. So here's what the tree actually represented. And this is where it gets really profound, so listen closely. The tree symbolized autonomous moral authority, the right to determine good and evil apart from God. When the serpent says, "You will be like God," knowing good and evil, he's not offering them divine knowledge, he's offering them divine prerogative. Think about how this plays out. Every parent knows this dynamic. The moment a child decides they'll determine right and wrong for themselves. My son's already doing it. He's a year and a half. The Jerome Biblical Commentary puts it perfectly. The knowledge of good and evil signifies moral autonomy rather than mere intellectual capacity, highlighting the human rejection of divine lordship. So eating wasn't about gaining information. It was about claiming authority, declaring independence from God's moral order. And here's the tragic irony. They gained exactly what they sought, moral autonomy, and it destroyed them. In other words, they chose to be like God in deciding what is right and wrong. They turned from God and said, "We can do this ourselves." They wanted to be the ones setting the moral rules instead of receiving them from their Creator. And they got exactly that, with all the devastating consequences that follow. But notice how the knowledge actually comes. It's not through eating magical fruit. It's through experiencing the consequences of rebellion. Verse 7 tells us their eyes were opened, and they knew they were naked. Verses 8 through 10 shows them hiding from God in fear and shame. They're learning about evil the hard way, by living it, feeling it, becoming alienated by it. This is experiential knowledge, not informational knowledge. They know evil because they are experiencing separation from the source of all good. Now here's the third misconception, and this one reveals how deeply we've misunderstood human nature itself. Most people think Adam and Eve fell from moral neutrality, like they were in some kind of spiritual Switzerland before choosing sides. Or think of it like this. Imagine someone who's never experienced betrayal telling you they understand loyalty. They might know the concept, but they lack the experiential knowledge of what trust actually costs. This view sees the original state as merely lacking corruption rather than possessing genuine holiness. But this completely misses what the text actually says about their original condition. Genesis 1:27 tells us they were made in the image of God. That's not neutrality. That's active participation in divine nature. The Catholic Catechism is crystal clear on this. Man was created in a state of holiness, original holiness, and original justice. They weren't morally neutral beings who happened to avoid sin. They were holy beings whose desires were naturally ordered toward God. And this is where it gets really beautiful. Their original state wasn't just the absence of sin, it was the presence of grace. Think about what naked and unashamed actually means. No guilt, no fear, no manipulation, no defensiveness. Aquinas explains in the Summa that in original justice, their lower appetites were perfectly subject to reason, and reason was perfectly subject to God. There was no war between flesh and spirit, no conflict between what they wanted and what was good. They experienced what every human heart longs for: perfect integration, harmony between desire and duty. This wasn't moral neutrality. This was moral excellence, the kind of goodness we spend our whole lives trying to recover. The fall was loss, not gain. So the fall wasn't a movement from neutrality to corruption. It was a catastrophic loss of supernatural gifts. This is important to delineate. And they didn't gain evil knowledge and lose innocence. They lost their participation in divine life and gained experiential knowledge of what that loss feels like. Look at what they actually experience after eating. They experience fear and shame, blame shifting, hiding from God. Fear, they are terrified when they hear God's voice. And shame, where they need to cover themselves. And the blame shifting, this part really gets me. Adam literally points to his wife and says, "The woman you gave me, she made me do it." That's perfect. That's so real. That's so normal. That is so our society today. Think about that for a second. It's not my fault, God. It's her fault. Actually, it's your fault for giving her to me. He's deflecting responsibility at every level. This demonstrates the complete breakdown of moral accountability that follows from claiming autonomous authority over good and evil. These aren't signs of gaining knowledge. These are signs of losing relationship with God, with each other, with themselves. The knowledge of good and evil they gained was the bitter experience of choosing autonomy over corruption, self-will over divine will. But here's where this misunderstanding creates a massive theological problem that most people don't even realize. If we misunderstand the original state and the nature of the fall, we completely misunderstand what's wrong with us now. The traditional view often portrays human nature as fundamentally flawed, with reason unable to discern moral truth and will unable to choose God. But that's not what Catholic theology actually teaches, and it's not what the text suggests. Yes, we are wounded. Yes, we have concupiscence, disordered desire that inclines us towards sin, but reason itself wasn't destroyed. Aquinas is brilliant on this. In the Summa, he explains that the fall wounded human nature, but didn't destroy its fundamental capacities. We can still recognize moral truth through natural law, even though it's harder. We can still choose good, even though we're inclined towards selfishness. Think about your own experience. When you see genuine injustice, don't you immediately recognize it as wrong? That recognition is reason functioning correctly. When you feel guilty after lying or stealing, that's conscience working properly, pointing you back toward truth. The problem isn't that our moral faculties are completely broken. The problem is that they are fighting against disordered desires. Before the fall, reason and desire worked together. After the fall, they're often in conflict. But the fact that we can recognize this conflict, feel guilty about moral failings, and admire genuine virtue, all of this shows that reason still tracks moral truth. And this has huge implications for how we live and how we view other people. If human reason is completely corrupted, then moral argument becomes pointless, and we wouldn't persuade anyone of anything. But if the reason can still recognize truth, even wounded reason, then dialogue, persuasion, and moral progress are all possible. This is why natural law thinking works across religious boundaries. Muslims, Jews, Christians, even thoughtful atheists can recognize many of the same moral truths. We are not trying to convince them of something their nature can't grasp. We are appealing to moral capacities they still possess. Now, I want to show you something in the text that most people miss, but it's absolutely crucial for understanding what happened. Look carefully at what Eve says to the serpent in verse 3. God's original command was, "You shall not eat of the tree." But Eve adds something. She says, "You shall not eat of it, nor shall you touch it." Now, there's no textual evidence that she simply forgot or that God gave her additional instruction. She's adding to God's word. And this addition reveals something profound about what's happening internally before the external act of disobedience. Think about how this works psychologically. When people are distancing themselves from someone, they often misrepresent that person's words. It's like when couples are fighting and one spouse says, "You always say I'm stupid," when the other spouse says, "That was a thoughtless comment." Eve's misquote suggests she's already beginning to turn away from God relationally, turning away from God, as Aquinas calls it. Aquinas explains in the Summa that sin begins internally with turning away from God before it manifests in external acts of turning toward creatures. So the real fall may have started with that subtle reframing of God's word, softening the command to make disobedience seem more plausible. She's negotiating with obedience, creating mental space for rebellion by making God's word seem more restrictive than it actually was. And this reveals a pattern we see constantly in human moral failure. We write the rules to justify our desires. How many times have you caught yourself doing this? You want something you know you shouldn't have, so you start reinterpreting the moral boundaries. This isn't really lying. It's just withholding information. This isn't stealing. I'll pay it back eventually. This isn't adultery. We're just friends. As Paul writes in Romans 1:18, we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. We use our rational faculties to rationalize what we already want to do. Eve's misquote of God's command shows this process beginning. She's already moving toward autonomy before she acts on it. Now let's look at how the serpent operates, because his strategy reveals something crucial about the nature of temptation. Notice he doesn't start with a direct contradiction. He begins with a question. Did God really say? This is masterful psychological manipulation. He's not openly challenging God's authority. He's inviting Eve to reinterpret it. The serpent leverages Eve's inexperience with evil to redirect her trust from God to her own autonomous reasoning. Think about how brilliant this strategy is. Instead of saying God is wrong, he says, "Are you sure that's what God means?" He's planting seeds of doubt without taking responsibility for the conclusion Eve draws. This is how deception often works. It doesn't force wrong conclusions. It creates conditions where people arrive at wrong conclusions themselves. And notice what he offers. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. He's not lying exactly. They will gain experiential knowledge. But he's withholding crucial information about what that experience will cost them. The serpent presents moral autonomy as freedom, but it's actually a redefinition of freedom as self-rule divorced from God's order. True freedom isn't the ability to choose anything. True freedom is the ability to choose what's actually good for you. Augustine puts it perfectly. True freedom is true freedom, being liberated to pursue the good, not free choice, mere free choice. The serpent offers them choice, but takes away their capacity to choose well. That's not freedom. That's slavery disguised as liberation. And here's the tragic irony. In seeking to become like God, they actually become less than human. So what actually happened when they ate? Let's look at the real consequences, not the Sunday school version. Verse 7, their eyes were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. The first consequence isn't gaining wisdom or moral knowledge, it's shame and the need for concealment. And isn't this exactly what we see today? Think about how people rationalize pornography consumption. They justify it, they minimize it, explain it away. But there's still that sense of shame when they're exposed, still that recognition that they wouldn't want others to know. That shame response isn't merely social conditioning. It reflects the human heart recognizing that something is fundamentally disordered. They're experiencing self-consciousness for the first time, seeing themselves as objects of potential judgment. But notice what happens when God comes looking for them in verse 8, they hide. These are people who used to walk with God in the cool of the day. Now they're running away and hiding behind trees. The fundamental relationship between creatures and creator has been shattered. And when God finds them, look at Adam's response in verse 12. The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate. He's not just blaming Eve, he's blaming God. The woman whom you gave me, the fracture goes all the way up. Every relationship is now broken with God, with each other, with themselves, with creation itself. What they've lost is what every human heart longs for: integration, harmony, and peace. Before, their desires naturally aligned with what was good. Now there's conflict between what they want and what they know is right. Instead of tending the garden of their hearts in harmony with God's design, they're now fighting thorns and thistles both in the ground and in their souls. This is what Paul describes in Romans 7. I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. They've gained the knowledge of good and evil, but it's the bitter knowledge of what they've lost through choosing autonomy. They know good by its absence and evil by its presence. That's not the kind of knowledge worth having. Now, for some, this whole analysis might seem like a bit much, but it has profound implications for how we understand human nature and salvation. If we get the problem wrong, we'll get the solution wrong too. Aquinas provides the framework that makes sense of all of this, and it's beautiful in its logical coherence. Remember, the problem isn't that humans lost the ability to recognize moral truth. The problem is that our desires became disordered. Even after the fall, reason can still apprehend natural law, the basic principles of practical reason. We can still recognize that good should be done and evil avoided, that promises should be kept, that innocent life should be protected. As Aquinas explains in the first part of the second part, natural law participates in eternal law. It's our rational participation in God's providence. So moral reasoning still works. It's harder because it's fighting against disordered desires, but it's not fundamentally broken. This is why moral argument is possible, why conscience still functions, why we can feel genuine guilt for moral failures. But here's where it gets really beautiful. What was lost through pride can be restored through grace. The integration they lost, reason ordered to God, desires ordered to reason, can be recovered through participation in divine life. Not just intellectually, but actually. Grace doesn't just change how we think about morality, it changes our capacity to live morally. This is why saints exist. Not because they are naturally better people, but because grace is actually restoring that original harmony. They're not just following rules. They're recovering the kind of freedom Adam and Eve had before the fall. Now, you might be thinking this is all fascinating theology. I hope. But what does it mean for how I live today? Everything. Because how you understand Genesis 3 shapes how you view every moral struggle you face. If you think moral reasoning is completely corrupted, you'll either despair of making progress or become relativistic about moral truth. But if you understand that reason can still track truth, even though desires are disordered, everything changes. It means moral progress is possible both individually and societally. When you feel convicted about a moral failing, it's not just social conditioning or evolutionary programming. That is reason recognizing objective moral truth. When you admire genuine virtues in others, you're not just expressing preferences. You're recognizing real moral excellence. And when you struggle with temptation, you're not just fighting against your true nature. You're fighting for your true nature against its corruption. This also explains why moral argument across worldviews is possible. Muslims and Jews, Christians, even thoughtful atheists can often recognize the same basic moral principles because reason still functions. We are not trying to convince people of something their nature can't grasp. We're appealing to moral capacities they still possess. Natural law provides common ground for dialogue about abortion, marriage, economic justice, and human rights, all the issues that matter. Because underneath our cultural differences, we share the same rational human nature with its basic orientation toward truth and goodness. So here's what we've seen. Genesis 3 isn't primarily about gaining knowledge. It's about choosing autonomy over relationship with God. The knowledge they gained was experiential knowledge of what it feels like to be cut off from the source of all goodness. They didn't fall from moral neutrality to corruption. They fell from holiness and integration to conflict and alienation. But reason itself wasn't destroyed, wounded, yes. Fighting against disordered desires, absolutely. But still capable of recognizing moral truth. And this gives us hope, both for our own moral struggles and for our ability to engage productively with others about moral questions. When someone tells you that morality is just cultural conditioning or evolutionary programming, you can point to this story. It explains why humans universally recognize that some things are genuinely right and wrong, even across cultures and centuries. Why we feel guilt for moral failures, why we admire virtue, why moral progress is possible, because we're made in God's image, and even though the image is marred, it's not destroyed. But here's the beautiful part. God didn't leave us in that broken state. He gave us a way back, not back to the Garden of Eden, but forward to something even better, eternal rest in Him. And this isn't about once saved, always saved. We need to continue striving in fidelity on this earth and faithfulness. But when we are assumed into Christ, when our bodies sleep, we'll be locked into eternity with Him, where falling away is no longer an option. As Glenn Scrivener puts it in The Air We Breathe, which is a great book, easy read, we are not just dirtbags. We are dirtbags kissed by heaven. We have value because of God, not in spite of Him. We are loved, and He gives us a way back through unmerited grace. Next time, I want to show you how this understanding of human nature provides the foundations of natural law ethics. How the same rational capacities that let us recognize mathematical truths also let us recognize moral truths. And why this matters for everything from bioethics to business ethics, to ethics of artificial intelligence. Because if Genesis 3 teaches us anything, it's that the choice between autonomy and relationship with God is still the fundamental choice facing every human heart. What do you think? Does this change how you read the fall narrative? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, keep wrestling with the big ideas. Thank you so much for watching the Thomistic Mystic. May you all have blessed weeks. God bless you and your families. So long.